Margaret was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, watching her husband Henry drive off again in his black Mercedes. His departures had become too frequent lately. "Another business trip, darling," he said, before driving off, not even looking her in the eye. "I'll be back in 3 days." Margaret sipped her coffee slowly from the porcelain cup they had bought together in Vienna on their 20th anniversary. Things had been different then. Henry looked at her with tenderness, held her hand, and told her about his plans for the future. "Something has changed," she whispered to herself as she looked at the old photos on the mantelpiece. Her friend Patricia came in unannounced as usual. They had known each other for 30 years. "Oh, I saw your Henry leave," Patricia said, taking off her hat. "On business again?" Margaret put her cup on the table. "That's what he says. The 3rd time this month." Patricia sat down across from her friend. "And you believe him?" "Why wouldn't I?" Margaret tried to smile, but it was strained. "Darling," Patricia leaned closer, "I don't want to upset you, but the last time I saw him was at Luigi's restaurant, and he wasn't alone." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "He was sitting at a table with a woman, a young woman, and they didn't look like business partners." Margaret got up and went to the window. "Maybe it was a client. He's in real estate, after all." "Margaret," Patricia said softly, "I saw him holding her hand, and the way they looked at each other." The room fell silent. Margaret continued to stare out the window, trying to remain calm. "You know," she finally said, "he's been working with cash a lot lately. He says it's more convenient for business. But before, everything went through the bank." Patricia walked over to her friend and put her hand on her shoulder. "You have the right to know the truth." "I know," Margaret replied quietly, "and I will know it." That evening, alone, Margaret took an old diary out of a drawer. On its pages, she began to write down everything unusual about Henry's behavior, the dates of his business trips, the amounts he withdrew from his account, strange phone calls. 42 years of marriage, she whispered, looking at their wedding photo. Was it all a lie? Margaret could feel something new emerging in her soul, not just suspicion or resentment, but a cold determination to find out the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. That night, Margaret could not sleep for a long time. She lay in their shared bed, which now seemed too big, and remembered how everything had changed gradually. First came the new ties, bright and youthful. Then came expensive perfume, which he had never bought before. Henry started going to the gym, although all his life he had been saying that the best sport was working in the garden. "I want to be in shape, honey," he would answer her questions. "At my age, it's important." Margaret went to the closet and opened his side. The new suit from the famous designer was still hanging in its case. $3,000, she thought, running her hand over the fabric. "And he told me it was a discount." She pulled out her phone and dialed her youngest daughter Alice's number. "Mom? Is something wrong?" Her daughter's sleepy voice sounded worried. "No, dear. Everything is fine. I just can't sleep. Is Daddy away on a business trip again?" Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes. Alice, have you noticed anything strange about your father's behavior lately?" There was silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," Alice finally said, "I didn't want to bother you, but I saw him at the mall last week. He was buying women's jewelry." Margaret felt her hands begin to tremble. Maybe it was a gift for me. "Mom, your birthday is in 5 months, and it wasn't the kind of jewelry you usually wear." Margaret looked down at her wedding ring, the simple gold band that Henry had placed on her finger 42 years ago. She remembered what he had said. "This is a symbol of our eternal love, my dear." "Thank you for telling me, darling," she said softly. "Sleep well." The next morning, Margaret woke up with a clear plan of action. She called her longtime friend Lucy, who worked at the bank where she and Henry had joined accounts. "Lucy, I need your help," she said as she met her friend in a small cafe away from the city center. "Is there something wrong with the accounts?" Lucy asked as she stirred her coffee. "Yes. I want to know about all of Henry's transactions for the last 6 months." Lucy looked at her friend warily. "Margaret, you do realize that this is confidential information, right? But I also realize that something is going on behind my back, and I have a right to know what it is." Lucy sighed. Very well, but it has to stay between us. Back at home, Margaret sat down at the old secretary in her room. She took out a notebook and began to methodically write down all the suspicious expenses. Restaurants they had never been to together, large amounts of cash withdrawn from different bank branches, purchases at women's clothing stores. $20,000 in the last month, she whispered, counting the amounts. Where did you put it, Henry? Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Patricia stood on the doorstep with a box of homemade cookies. I thought you might need some company, she said as she walked into the house. Patricia, Margaret closed the door and turned to her friend. Tell me honestly, that woman in the restaurant? What did she look like? Patricia put the box on the table. Are you sure you want to know? She was about 45, slender, elegant, blonde hair, expensive clothes. Margaret smiled bitterly. I get it. A younger version of me. Margaret, what are you going to do? Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the well-kept garden she and Henry had created together for so many years. For now, to observe and gather information. And then, she turned to her friend, and a steely glint appeared in her eyes. Then I will make him regret his betrayal. Sunday mornings were always a time of peace and reflection for Margaret. She and Henry usually ate breakfast together on the veranda, discussing their plans for the week. But not today. Henry was away again. Margaret slowly climbed the stairs to their shared study. It smelled like expensive tobacco, Henry's new habit. He had never smoked in the house before. I need to get some air, she muttered as she opened the window. Her eyes rested on the massive oak desk. How many evenings had they spent here together, sorting out accounts and planning for the future? Now Henry always locked his drawer and took the key away. So you don't have to worry about business, dear, he would say with a forced smile. Margaret walked over to the table and ran her hand over the polished surface. Suddenly, her fingers felt something under the edge of the tabletop. A small envelope taped down. What is it? She whispered, carefully peeling the envelope off. Inside was a small key. Margaret's heart beat faster. She knew she shouldn't do this, but... 42 years old, she said aloud. I have a right to know. The key fit the drawer lock perfectly. Inside were neatly folded papers. Margaret began to look through them, and her hands shook. New Horizon Bank? She wondered. We've never had an account there, but the statement said otherwise. A private account in Henry's name, opened 6 months ago. And the amounts... Margaret had to sit down. $120,000? Where did it come from? She continued flipping through the papers. Each document told its own story. Regular transfers from joint accounts, large cash withdrawals, unexplained expenses. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Patricia. You should know, my friend said without greeting me. I just saw them again. Margaret clutched the phone. Where? Outside a jewelry store on Oak Street. They were picking out a ring, Margaret. Silence hung in the air. Margaret stared at the papers in front of her. Tell me everything, Patricia. What did they look like? She held on to his hand. She was laughing. And he looked happy, Margaret. I'm sorry to say this. Margaret closed her eyes. Go on. They spent almost an hour in the store. Then they went to that new French restaurant. The one I asked him to take me to for our anniversary? Yes, Patricia answered quietly. Margaret hung up the phone and went back to the documents. Now it all made sense. The expensive gifts, the restaurants, the hotels. He was preparing for a new life, without her. She carefully put all the papers back in the drawer, except for one, the New Horizon account statement. She tucked it into her robe pocket. As she walked down the stairs, Margaret heard the front door open. Henry was home early. Darling, he called from downstairs. I've brought you a present. Margaret stopped on the stairs, trying to control herself. There was a false joy in his voice that she hadn't noticed before. How long had he been playing this role? I'm coming, dear, she replied, forcing a smile. In the hallway, Henry held a box from a local candy store, her favorite chocolates. In the past, such a gesture would have touched her. Now she saw it only as an attempt to hide her guilt. How was your business trip? She asked, accepting the gift. Oh, everything was great. He kissed her on the cheek. We signed a new contract. We're going to build a residential complex. Bullshit, Margaret thought, but smiled. I'm glad, dear. Maybe you can tell me the details over dinner? Excuse me, darling. He looked at his watch. I have another important meeting. I'll be back late, so don't wait. When the door closed behind him, Margaret went to the window and watched his car disappear around the corner. In the pocket of her robe was a bank statement, proof of his infidelity. But that wasn't enough. She had to find out everything. On Monday morning, Margaret felt strangely calm. A plan had begun to form in her mind the night before, as she lay awake listening to Henry's calm breathing next to her. Are you going to the office today? She asked, as she served him coffee over breakfast. Yes, darling. Lots of work on a new project, Henry replied, not even looking up from his phone. Margaret noticed a slight smile on his face as he read the message. He used to smile the same way when he read her notes that she put in his briefcase. I'm meeting Patricia today, she said casually. It's been a while since we've been to an antique store. That's great, dear. Just don't spend too much. He finally looked up and smiled. How generous of you, Margaret thought, recalling the amounts in the secret account. When Henry left, Margaret quickly changed her clothes. Instead of her usual elegant suit, she chose simple clothes and an old cloak that she hadn't worn in a long time. The gray wig she had bought for last year's masquerade completed the look. Perfect, she said to her reflection. No one would recognize the wife of successful businessman Henry White. The taxi took her to her husband's office in 15 minutes. She took a position in a small coffee shop across the street, where she could see the entrance to the building. Another coffee, please, she asked the waitress after 2 hours of waiting. Suddenly, she saw Henry coming out of the building, but instead of getting into his Mercedes, he headed for a modest Ford parked nearby. So now you're driving 2 cars, Margaret whispered, pulling out her phone. She quickly typed a message to her nephew Tom, who worked for the police. I need information about a Ford Focus, license plate KLM 4567. It's important. The answer came back 10 minutes later. Rented 3 months ago. The name is Henry White. Margaret took a new taxi and followed the nondescript gray Ford. Henry's car pulled up in front of a residential complex in a prestigious area of the city. Please wait, she asked the taxi driver. Henry got out of the car, holding a bouquet of roses and a package from an expensive boutique. Margaret took out her phone and took a few photos. Now to the New Horizon Bank, she told the taxi driver as Henry disappeared into the building. At the bank, Margaret had some bad news. I'm sorry, Mrs. White, said a young employee, but we can't give out account information without the owner present. But I am his wife. Unfortunately, the account was opened for one person, with no access for family members. Back at home, Margaret sat down at her secretary and started writing. Monday, rented car, Riverside Park Residential Complex, apartment unknown, roses and package from Chanel Boutique. A phone call interrupted her notes. Mom? It was Alice. Are you okay? Something strange is happening with Dad. Margaret sighed. What do you mean, dear? He just called me. He asked to borrow $30,000. He said it was for business, urgent. Margaret clenched her pencil. And what did you say? I told him I had to consult Michael. Mom, Dad never asked us for money. Is something going on? Don't worry, honey. I'll take care of it. Henry came home late that night, smelling of expensive perfume. Sorry, I got held up at work, he said, heading for the bathroom. Margaret watched him go up the stairs and thought about all the lies he had told, the double life he had led, about the daughter from whom he asked for money. Sweet dreams, dear, she said as he went to bed. You too, darling, he replied, turning on his other side. Margaret lay awake, listening to his breathing and planning the next day of observations. She knew that somewhere in this tangle of lies there must be a thread that could be pulled to unravel everything. That morning, Margaret got ready faster than usual. She knew that today she had to find out more about the mysterious woman who had ruined her life. I'm going to see Alice today, she told Henry over breakfast. She asked for help choosing new curtains. Henry just nodded, looking at his phone again. Okay, honey, give her my best. Instead of going to her daughter's house, Margaret took up her vantage point again in the coffee shop across the street from her husband's office. This time, she brought her notebook with her. Would you like some more coffee? The friendly waitress asked, recognizing her by now. Yes, please. And? Margaret hesitated. Do you often see a man with gray hair working in that building? Tall, always in a blue suit? The waitress smiled. Oh, Mr. White? Yes, he comes in a lot, usually with a beautiful blonde. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Really? And how long ago? 6 months, maybe more. She works as a realtor at Golden Homes. Belinda, I think. Finally, Margaret thought, the mystery has a name. She pulled out her phone and quickly found the Golden Homes website. On the Our Team page, she saw her, Belinda Carter, a leading luxury real estate sales specialist. 45 years old, Margaret whispered, staring at the photo of the smiling blonde. Almost 20 years younger than I. At that moment, she saw Henry coming out of the building, and next to him, her. Belinda was even more beautiful than in the photo. She moved gracefully in high heels, her hair shining in the sun. Margaret watched as they got into the rented Ford. Henry opened the door for her, as he used to do for his wife. The bill, please, Margaret asked, taking out her wallet. Oh, don't worry, the waitress said. Mr. White always leaves money on your tab. What? Margaret froze. Yes, he said you were his sister? And he asked me to take care of you. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. He knew. All this time he'd known she was watching him. At home, she immediately rushed to the computer. Belinda's social media page told her more than all the days of surveillance. A beautiful evening with a special person, reads the caption under a photo of a restaurant where the edge of Henry's suit is visible. New life needs a new home, a post from a month ago. Sometimes the best gifts come unexpectedly. A photo of an expensive bracelet Margaret had seen in her bank statements. A phone call interrupted her research. Margaret? Patricia's voice sounded worried. Are you sitting down? What's wrong? I just came from the hairdresser. You won't believe who was sitting in the next chair. Margaret clutched the phone. Her? Margaret. Yeah. And she was on the phone. With Henry. They're planning a trip to Europe. Next month. Margaret closed her eyes. What else did you hear? She was talking about some money. Something about everything is almost ready and that we will be free soon. At that moment, Margaret heard the front door open. I'll call you back, she said quickly and hung up. Henry entered the office holding a large envelope. Oh, you're home? What about Alice's curtains? She changed her mind, Margaret replied, looking him calmly in the eye. And how was your day, dear? Did you get a lot of work done? Yes, dear. Very tired. I'm going to take a shower. When he left, Margaret looked at her hands, and they were not shaking. She felt strangely calm. She knew enough now. It was time to act. Margaret had always thought of herself as a smart woman. There was a reason she had been appointed chief accountant at the largest bank in town, where she had worked for 30 years. Now it was time to use all her knowledge. In her office, behind closed doors, all the evidence she had gathered lay on her desk. Bank statements, photographs, records of conversations and observations. They think I'm a stupid old woman, she whispered as she spread out the papers. That I will just step aside. Suddenly the doorbell rang. It was Richard, her old friend and former colleague from the bank. Hi, Margaret, he said, coming into the office. I brought what you asked for. Richard put an old file on the table. A case from '93. Fraud with counterfeit banknotes. Do you remember? How could I forget? Margaret replied. We worked on it for months back then. Richard sat back in his chair. May I ask why you need this information after all these years? Margaret went to the window. Tell me, Richard, do you still keep in touch with Thomas? That expert in making collectible copies of banknotes? Thomas Brown? Yes, we see each other sometimes. He teaches at the university now, but he still works on his collection. Margaret returned to the table. I need his help. But this must remain between us. Richard looked at her carefully. Margaret, what's going on? She sat down across from him and told him everything. About Henry, about Belinda, about the hidden accounts and the plans to escape. Oh my God, Richard whispered when she was done. What are you going to do? What they do with counterfeiters. Margaret replied with a bitter smile. Give them a taste of their own medicine. Richard rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Thomas could help. His copies are indistinguishable from the original without special expertise. But it's risky. Life is a risky business, Margaret replied. Call him. Tell him it's a personal request. After Richard left, Margaret sat in silence for a long time, thinking about her plan. She remembered what Henry had once said. Money is just paper. It's the people you trust that matter. Well, darling, she whispered, let's see if you like your own philosophy. 2 days later, she met with Thomas Brown in his university office. This is a delicate matter, he said, looking at Margaret carefully over his glasses. You realize that my collector's copies are not intended for circulation, Margaret finished. Of course, it's just demonstration material. Thomas nodded. And how much of this material do you need? Margaret, 120,000. He whistled. That's quite a collection. It will take time. Margaret replied, Plenty of time, she said. The main thing is quality. On her way home, she stopped by her and Henry's bank. In the safe deposit box was real money. The whole of their life together turned into bills. Soon, she whispered. Soon everything would change. At home, Henry greeted her with unusual attention. Where have you been, dear? I was worried. Oh, just meeting up with some old friends, she replied. We were reminiscing about the past. He kissed her on the cheek. It's good that you're not lonely at home. If you only knew, Margaret thought. If you only knew. For 2 weeks, Margaret waited for a call from Thomas. Every time the phone rang, her heart started to beat faster. During this time, she managed to learn Henry's schedule to perfection. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he met Belinda at Luigi's restaurant. Every Friday, he went to the New Horizon Bank, where she suspected he was preparing money for his escape. Finally, on Wednesday morning, she received a message from Thomas. The collection is ready. Meet me at 3 in the university library. I'm going to the hairdresser, dear, Margaret Henry said. Then maybe I'll go shopping. All right, dear. Don't spend too much, he replied, not even looking up from the newspaper. At the library, Thomas was waiting for her in the old manuscripts section. He looked worried. Mrs. White, are you sure about this? Margaret nodded. Absolutely. He handed her a small suitcase. Everything is in there. Every copy is perfect for the collection. But remember, they are not for... I remember, Margaret interrupted him. This is just visual material. On her way home, she felt the suitcase pulling her hand away. 120,000, she thought. The price of betrayal. At home, Margaret went straight up to their bedroom. The safe was hidden behind a painting, a commonplace place, but Henry had always loved simplicity. The combination was their wedding date. At least he didn't change anything, she thought bitterly. Margaret took out the real money and began to methodically replace it with copies. She put each packet in exactly the same position as it had been before. Her hands didn't tremble. The years of working with money had paid off. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car pulling up to the house. Her heart sank. Henry had to be at work for a few more hours. Calm down, she whispered to herself. Just be calm. Quickly putting the last of the wads in the safe, she hid the real money in her suitcase and shoved it under the bed. At that moment, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Margaret? Henry's voice came from downstairs. I'm in the bedroom, dear, she answered, trying to make her voice sound natural. I'm just cleaning up a little. Footsteps approached the door. Margaret quickly grabbed a cloth and began wiping the dressing table. You're early today, she said as Henry entered. Yes, we canceled an appointment, he said, and kissed her on the cheek. Oh, did you go to the hairdresser? Your hair looks nice. Thank you, she replied, feeling her heart beating somewhere in her throat. I need to get something from the safe, he said, walking over to the painting. Margaret froze, but continued to wipe the table. Of course, dear. She watched in the mirror as he opened the safe, took out one of the packs, the same ones she had just replaced, and put them in his briefcase. Is everything okay? She asked. Yes. I just need to pay some bills for a new project, he replied, closing the safe. Don't expect me back before dinner. I have an important meeting. With Belinda, Margaret thought. At a restaurant you've never been to with me. When Henry left, she sank down on the bed. Her heart was still pounding. She pulled out her phone and dialed Patricia's number. Done. Now we just have to wait. Do you really think he won't notice? Her friend asked. Thomas is a real master. Even I wouldn't know the difference if I didn't know better. In the evening, when Henry came home, he smelled of Belinda's perfume again. He looked pleased. Apparently, dinner went well. How was the meeting? Margaret asked him as she served him tea. Productive, he replied. I think we'll have some good news soon. Oh yes, Margaret thought. Very good news. That night she couldn't sleep for a long time. The real money, hidden in a suitcase under her bed, seemed to be burning through the floor. But Margaret knew this was only the beginning. Now she had to wait for Henry and Belinda to try to use the counterfeit bills. She turned on her side and looked at her sleeping husband. 42 years together. Thousands of evenings together. 1,000,000 stories told. And he was ready to exchange all of this for a younger woman and a new life. Sweet dreams, darling, she whispered. You will soon wake up in a completely different reality. The next week brought noticeable changes in Henry's behavior. He became restless, checked the safe more often, and talked on the phone in whispers for long periods of time in the backyard. One morning, Margaret heard him talking to someone in his office. Yes, dear, everything is ready. Tickets are purchased. Yes, first class. Of course, no one knows. Except me, Margaret thought as she stood quietly outside the door. Next week, Henry continued. Yes, I have all the money with me. Don't worry, Belinda, I've thought of everything. Margaret smiled silently. She had noticed how he had been sitting over the European travel guides for a long time last night, carefully hiding them when she entered the room. Darling, she called when he finished talking. I've made breakfast. Henry was unusually talkative at the table. You know, honey, I think we should have a party. Invite some friends over like we used to. Margaret raised an eyebrow. A party? What's the occasion? No reason, he shrugged. Life is short. You have to be able to enjoy the moment. A farewell party, Margaret realized. One last act before you disappear. That's a great idea, she said. When do you want to have it? How about Saturday? He tried to sound carefree. We'll invite some close friends, nothing special. Margaret nodded. Okay, I'll make the arrangements. She began calling guests, watching Henry fussing with papers in his office. Several times, she noticed him transferring money from the safe to a small suitcase he had hidden in the garage. In the evening, Alice called, Mom, Dad invited us to a party. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Why is it strange, dear? Margaret asked calmly. He never liked such events. And why so suddenly? Maybe he just missed his family. Mom, Alice's voice became more serious. Are you sure everything is okay? Margaret sighed. You should come to the party, daughter. I think it will be interesting. On Friday, the day before the party, Henry went to New Horizon Bank again. Margaret watched him leave with a small briefcase. Final preparations, she whispered as she dialed Patricia's number. Are you sure he's planning to leave right after the party? Her friend asked. Absolutely. I found the tickets in his office. Sunday's flight to Paris. Oh my God, Margaret, what are you going to do? What I planned. Give him a taste of betrayal. Henry was unusually gentle that evening. He brought her flowers and suggested that they watch an old movie together. You know, he said, hugging her. I often think about how lucky we were to meet each other. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. Really? Yes, I do. You've always been my rock. My reliable rear. Backbone, she thought. Not love, not friend, a backbone. And you are mine, dear, she replied, keeping the bitterness out of her voice. At night, she heard him get up and go to the study. The sound of a safe opening, the rustle of papers, then quiet footsteps to the garage. He's getting ready, Margaret thought, packing her suitcase for a new life. She lay in the dark, thinking about tomorrow's party, about the surprised faces of the guests when the truth came out, about Belinda's reaction when she tried to use the fake money. Sometimes, she whispered into the darkness, the best revenge is to give someone exactly what they want. Saturday morning began with a commotion. Margaret had been preparing for the party since dawn, and Henry, contrary to his habit of sleeping late on weekends, was up at 7. "Shall I help you, dear?" he asked, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "No, thank you, I'll be fine," Margaret replied, watching him glance at his watch every now and then. Around noon, Patricia called. "Are you ready?" she asked in a whisper. "More than ever," Margaret replied. "Did you bring what I asked for?" "Yes, I have the papers. But Margaret, maybe it's not too late to stop this?" It was late when he decided to destroy our lives. At 5 in the evening, the guests began to arrive. Alice was the first to arrive, with her husband and children. She immediately noticed the strange atmosphere in the house. "Mom," she whispered, pulling Margaret aside. "Is something going on? Dad is acting strange." Margaret hugged her daughter. "Just watch, dear. Everything will become clear soon." Meanwhile, Henry was the center of attention. He told jokes, raised toasts, and talked about how much he appreciated everyone there. But Margaret noticed how he was constantly checking his phone, how his eyes kept stopping on his watch. At 7 in the evening, he approached her. "Darling, I urgently need to go to the office. I forgot some important documents for a meeting tomorrow." "On Sunday?" she asked quietly. "Yes, an international client, time difference." He tried to sound confident, but he didn't look her in the eye. Margaret nodded. "Of course, dear. Don't be long." She watched as he went upstairs as he entered the bedroom. She heard the sound of the safe opening. A few minutes later, he came downstairs with a small suitcase. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Alice asked, noticing the suitcase. "Yes, just some papers." He kissed her cheek. "I'll be back soon." Margaret went to the window and watched his car disappear around the corner. At that moment, Patricia came up to her. "Did he leave?" "Yes." Margaret turned back to the guests. "Now the real party will begin." She raised her glass and tapped it with her fork. "Dear friends, I want to say a few words." Everyone turned to her. Alice looked intently at her mother. "My husband, Henry," Margaret began in a calm voice, "is on his way to the airport now. He has $120,000 in his suitcase, which he withdrew from our joint accounts. He plans to flee to Europe with his mistress, Belinda." The room fell dead silent. Alice put her hand over her mouth. "But there is one interesting detail," Margaret continued with a slight smile. "This money, it's not quite real." She took an envelope from her purse. "Here is a certificate from the expert who created these copies for the collection. And here," she pulled out another document, "are the statements from the New Horizon Bank, where Henry opened a secret account." Patricia walked over and put her arm around her friend. Alice, still in shock, ran to her mother. "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" "Because sometimes, dear, the best answer is to give a person exactly what they want. Henry wanted to run away with the money? Well, now he has that opportunity." At that moment, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Yes?" she answered calmly. "Mrs. White?" said an unfamiliar voice. "It's the airport security." Margaret smiled. "Yes, I know. My husband just tried to check in with counterfeit money." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Tell him," she continued, "that the real money is in a safe place, and that his mistress might not be waiting for him in Paris." She hung up and turned to her stunned guests. "Now, I think we could all use another glass of wine. We have a long night of conversation ahead of us. Margaret spent a sleepless night after the party. Alice insisted on staying with her, but she refused. I need time to be alone, dear. Go home, the kids are waiting." At 3 in the morning, the phone rang. It was the police station. "Mrs. White? Your husband wants to talk to you." "Tell him I'll talk to him at home," she answered calmly, "when he is released." Henry returned around 8 in the morning. He looked 10 years older, a crumpled suit, a disheveled shirt, gray hair tousled. "How could you?" were his first words when he crossed the threshold. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair, calmly drinking her morning coffee. "Sit down, Henry, we need to talk. Talk?" he almost shouted. "You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool. They kept me at the police station all night. What did you think?" Her voice remained steady. "That you could just take the money and run away? Leave your wife, children, grandchildren?" He sank down on the couch, covering his face with his hands. "Belinda. She was waiting for me at the airport. When the police found the fake money, she just left. Didn't even look back. Of course. Margaret sipped her coffee. She wanted a rich lover, not a scandal with the police. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Belinda, furious, with smeared mascara under her eyes. "You!" she rushed to Margaret. "You've ruined everything!" Margaret calmly put the cup down. "Me? I wasn't the one who planned to run away with a strange man and money. Henry said he loved me, that we were going to start a new life. Love?" Margaret stood up. "Do you really think that was love? He wanted a young mistress. You wanted his money. A rather banal story." Henry looked from one woman to the other. "Belinda, I can explain everything." "Explain what?" She turned to him. "That you're a loser who couldn't even tell real money from counterfeit? What will they say about me now? I'm a realtor. I need a reputation." Margaret watched this scene with a strange calmness. 42 years of marriage had crumbled before her eyes, but she felt only relief. "Here's the real money," she said, pulling out a suitcase from under the chair. "You can have your share, Henry, after the divorce." Belinda rushed to the suitcase. "Is it all in here? All 120,000? "I see he told you the exact amount," Margaret smiled. "But that money belongs to the White family, and as far as I know, you're not part of that family." "You?" Belinda choked on her rage. "You're an old, useless woman. He was unhappy with you." "Perhaps," Margaret replied calmly. "But now he is unhappy with you. Do you feel the difference?" At that moment, Alice entered the room. She stopped in the doorway, assessing the situation. "What is she doing here?" she asked, looking at Belinda. "She's leaving," Margaret replied. "Isn't she?" Belinda looked from Henry to the suitcase with the money, then to Alice. This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, and ran out of the house. The room fell silent. Henry sat with his head down. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now?" Margaret looked at her daughter. "Now you will pack your things and leave. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce. But all our years together." "That's what you should have been thinking about when you were planning your escape," Alice replied instead of her mother. "Go, Dad. Just go." Henry rose slowly and stumbled toward the stairs. His shoulders slumped. He looked small and old. "I'll send your things later," Margaret said after him. "And don't try to contact Belinda. She's already found a new target. I hear there's a rich new lawyer in town. 6 months passed. Autumn colored the leaves in the garden, which Margaret now tended alone. The divorce proceedings were completed quickly. Henry did not argue over the division of property, perhaps still ashamed of his failure. On this Sunday morning, Margaret was sitting on the veranda with Patricia, enjoying a cup of coffee. "Have you heard the latest news?" her friend asked. "Belinda did marry that lawyer after all." Margaret smiled. "I hope he checked his safe." "And Henry?" Patricia hesitated. "They say he moved to another city. I know. Alice told me. He got a job with a small construction company. He lives in a rented apartment. Do you feel sorry for him?" Margaret looked out at the garden thoughtfully. No. I feel sorry for the years I spent believing in our life together. But no." At that moment, Alice's car pulled up. The grandchildren ran out of it, rushing to hug their grandmother. "Grandma, we brought your favorite pies. And not just pies." Alice smiled, taking the bags out of the car. "Mom, we've enrolled you in Italian classes. You've always wanted to learn Italian, haven't you?" Margaret hugged her daughter tearfully. "But my dear, no buts. You've always put off your dreams. First because of work, then because of your father. Now it's your time." At lunch in the garden, Patricia raised her glass. "To a new life, and to old friends," Margaret added, "who are helping to build this new life." In the evening, when everyone had left, Margaret went up to her office. On the table was an unfinished manuscript. She had started writing a book about her experience. "How to Recognize and Survive Betrayal" was the working title. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. It was her former colleague from the bank. "Margaret, you won't believe this. Do you remember that charity we talked about? They're looking for a part-time financial consultant, and you thought of me?" Margaret smiled. "Who else could I think of? With your experience and knowledge." After finishing the conversation, Margaret went to the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm colors. In the neighboring house, a young couple was renovating, and she could hear laughter and hammers. "Life goes on," she whispered. On the table was a travel agency brochure, a tour of Italy that she had dreamed of for so many years. Next to it was a schedule of Italian classes and an invitation to a charity event from the local Animal Protection Society. Margaret sat down at her desk and opened her diary. "Today, I realized that Henry's betrayal didn't destroy my life. It gave me a chance to start a new one. I no longer need to live by other people's desires, hide my dreams, or postpone my plans for later. Now I am the boss of my life, and do you know what? At the age of 65, it is just beginning. P.S. Don't forget to buy tickets to Venice, and call the charity fund." Closing her diary, Margaret felt a strange peace. Birds were singing outside the window, and the aroma of the freshly baked pie she had made in the morning came from the kitchen. Her home, her garden, her life, all of it belonged to her now. "To new beginnings," she whispered as she lifted her cup of tea, "and for the wisdom to value yourself more than other people's promises."